Dark Souls, more than any other game, is your story, and I mean that in a very literal sense. Your character in Dark Souls is you. There isn't some gap between what your character experiences and what you experience, and in this way it's closer to a tabletop role-playing game than numerous more traditional CRPGs. There's a reason your character doesn't have an in-game voice, even though they interact with other characters, and in later games even tell them more than yes or no. It's the same reason you start the game in a cell as a hollow. Part 1. Characters are onions. Hollowing is a big deal in Dark Souls, if you hadn't noticed, and is one of the narrative and gameplay's most interesting and connected elements. Notice how I said gameplay and narrative. While it's seemingly a narrative element, first and foremost, it has gameplay built around it to varying degrees across all three games, and even more so, it's what inexorably ties the gameplay and narrative together. The process of hollowing is often described as losing or forgetting one's purpose, and eventually losing one's connection with their humanity altogether, and going mad. Gameplay-wise, the merchants you encounter will go hollow once they run out of stock, losing their purpose to you and themselves all at once. Other characters will hollow as they lose faith in their beliefs or purpose. Your character has three states of being: human, partially hollow, and fully hollow. Being human allows you to interact with other players in your world. Humans are social beings after all. Being partially hollow prevents this. Depression is a positive feedback loop. And depending on the game, will lower your maximum health. Then what does it mean to be fully hollow? Well, it's not expressly in the game, that's not the whole truth. Before I say what I mean, let's talk about the word itself. Hollow. It's a good word, isn't it? It's not that commonly used, and it provokes some thought. If something is hollow, it has no core. It's often light and can easily be carried away by outside forces. It's often fragile. All these attributes of the word can describe your character in Dark Souls and your interaction with Dark Souls as a whole. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because someone told you. You might even agree that preserving the Age of Fire is a good idea. You might believe that ending it's the better choice, but the question in the end is why? Because you were told that's what you should be doing. Because that's the purpose given to you. You and your character are swept away by the schemes and machinations of the gods, other ancient beings, and the designers. You're never told the whole truth. You don't need it. All you need is enough purpose to stave off fully becoming a hollow. All you need is enough purpose to keep playing the game. What keeps you playing Dark Souls can be a fragile thing, and as is the case with most games, most never finish them. Your character, outside of extreme cases, is fragile, falling to a few blows by most enemies. The last point's the most important. You are your character's core. This is where the final, full stage of hollowing comes in. Characters who are fully hollow are mindless husks. What is your character without you? An empty shell with no purpose. If you quit the game before you finish it, your character is hollow, doomed to wait on your hard drive to again be given purpose. This is the genius of the world From Software has created. There's one failure state to the game and the story, not finishing it. Every player death is a chance for that fragile connection between player and character to be broken. Every death brings your character closer to losing you. Every death is a step closer to becoming hollow. Hollowing is Dark Souls philosophy distilled into a single concept and used to elegantly have players roleplay the experience, whether they realize it or not. Whether you're searching for the truth, satisfying your bloodlust, or quitting the game, the narrative fits with what you, the player, are doing and feeling at that moment. All the Lords or Cath need is someone willing to be given a direction. It doesn't matter to them or the narrative if your motivations are pure or purely vindictive. In this way, the series is deeply existential, almost to a fault. It doesn't care how many people you decide to murder. It's not going to judge you on whether you decided to protect the status quo. It'll only give you enough information so you can have purpose. Otherwise, it's up to you to find your own meaning. It's up to you and only you to decide whether you are a hero, a villain, a pawn, or something else. With all this in mind, what's the answer to why the game starts in an asylum? Sure, it's a fantasy cliche to start as a prisoner and work your way up, but the asylum runs a little deeper than that, and it ties into New Game Plus. The asylum is populated almost exclusively by mindless hollows, and as much as this is a well-conceived piece of world building and easing players into the gameplay, it also provides the perfect place to leave characters after beating the game. It's quite common for players to beat the game and never do New Game Plus, and what better place for a character to hollow than the asylum meant to contain them? This total lack of distance between character and player experience also can be felt with the series' final bosses. They aren't usually the hardest boss, almost the opposite. Some of this is in part because of how few people finish games, meaning it's usually better to front-load quality content, but considering the games are as much about the nature of purpose and finding meaning as they are about growing in ability, the easier final bosses fit the mold perfectly. Both you and your character grow considerably as you progress through the story. Your character becomes more efficient at wielding their chosen weapons, hardier and more agile, while you the player grow your understanding of enemies, systems, and the world. By the end of the game, it's a combination of your character's abilities and your own that make the final bosses less of a challenge. Also have noticed that the final bosses in the series aren't powerful by the time you encounter them. Gwyn may have once been a god, but he's a hollowed husk of what he once was. Nashandra is only a fragment of Manus, one of the most difficult bosses from the first game, and the Soul of Cinder might be an amalgamation of those who've come before you, but you've surpassed them all to even reach that point in the story. Even thinking about the music tied to each boss fight should emphasize this point. While it's certainly true that numerous bosses across the series have melancholy themes, I'm looking at you, Sif and Arturius. Final bosses are often the most overt, particularly Gwyn's theme and its callback in the third game. Not only is it a melancholy moment to be reaching the end of your journey, Dark Souls wants players to think about the meaning of their actions, in hearing the piano in the first game, the strings and choir in the second, the piano and strings in the updated version, or the transition from brass to piano in the third is a catalyst for this. Why are you doing this? What comes after this victory? The last minutes are as much about these questions as overcoming one last challenge. The final bosses and endings in the series are supposed to be somber moments of reflection on all you've managed to accomplish and what purpose it ultimately served. Unlike most other epic RPGs, Dark Souls has no epilogue, just a short scene depicting your immediate and final actions. You're the only one who can reflect on your journey. It's your story after all, and the ones who make history don't often see its results. Part 2. What was I doing? With all this in mind, Dark Souls 2 is by far the strangest of From Software's modern titles. Like everything in life, it isn't flawless, and it's not as tightly designed as its contemporaries, in part thanks to its less than perfect development cycle. Its narrative is an oddity as well, focusing more on the player and your character than any other game in From Software's modern catalog. On release, many cited this as a major problem, myself included, but time has tempered my views, and what I've said should provide the answer as to why I've grown a little softer towards it. Dark Souls is always your story. Dark Souls 2's more intense focus on your relationship with your character is both its greatest strength and a source of many of its shortcomings. If Dark Souls' underlying point is the human need for purpose and how quickly we latch on to any source of it, Dark Souls 2, while still dealing with purpose, turns its attention to the need for hope and memory to the human experience. What are we without hope? Who are we with no past? Can we be human without hope or memory? As you begin your journey to Drang Lake, you're told that it houses a cure for your curse, and this is your journey's purpose. The curse is as I've described it before, though memory has become explicitly wrapped around hollowing this time. The characters you meet all lose their memories and some of their humanity along with it. After all, without our past, how do we know who we are? This holds doubly true for you and your character. It's up to the player to remember their character's past. Once you reach the mostly deserted town of Majula, you're immediately asked if you might be the next monarch or are a pawn of fate. This question, while a little ham-fisted compared to the manipulations of its predecessor, is the heart of why Dark Souls 2's plot is so obtuse. Remember, you the player are the core of your character, and within 5 minutes you've been given two very different purposes, one of which you'll forget. And that's the point. What's affecting everyone you come across, this slipping of their memories, their sanity, and their humanity can't possibly affect you, right? Why are you on your journey? Why did you turn the game on? You the player are as cursed as everyone else in this story. You've forgotten why you came to Drang Lake, and it's all thanks to one person. Yet as long as you don't abandon a purpose, you won't end up like everyone else. You won't end up a hollow. But Dark Souls 2 asks a little more from you to keep anything other than the bare minimum. It asks you to recognize your own tragedy even as you succumb to it. What you originally set out for, should you even remember it, is a lie. There is no cure for the curse of living in the world of Dark Souls. There's only purpose, and even then it's not yours. It's never yours. That's what it means to be undead. That's what it means to be a player. You either lose your purpose and wander aimlessly, or you latch on to the most convenient reason to press forward. Dark Souls as a whole is about experiencing tragedy, and Dark Souls 2 focuses on your own personal tragedy more than any other game in the series. The Emerald Herald asks you if you're the next monarch or a pawn of fate, and even if you once understood why you came to Drang Lake, you'll have forgotten as you defeat the last boss. At this point, are you any better than the characters you found and eventually left behind? Is there any real difference in the answers to the Emerald Herald's question? You're very much a pawn caught between plans laid long ago and Nashandra's scheming. How can you be a monarch if you're only pressing forward in the hopes of answers or finding some kind of meaning in the world? By the time we sit on the throne or let the world fade away, we've surpassed everyone else, but somehow this still rings hollow. The point of Dark Souls 2 is that without the past, we can't understand the present. Without understanding Lordran in Dark Souls 1, understanding Drang Lake in Dark Souls 2 is that much harder. Without first understanding that a lack of purpose will cause madness and despair, you can't understand that purpose alone is not enough. We, the players, experience this all throughout Dark Souls 2, and it's uncomfortable to not really know why you're doing something. We stave off hollowing in the hopes of some answers, yet those answers are buried in Dark Souls 1, the history of Drang Lake, and our own thoughts. The experience of playing Dark Souls 2 is the experience of seeking out more than just purpose, because if purpose alone was enough to satisfy a human existence, the end of our journey wouldn't feel so hollow. I'm not saying Dark Souls 2 isn't flawed, its more patchwork layout and strange difficulty curve is likely down to switching directors partway through development and needing to stay within deadlines. Its narrative coherence or lack thereof isn't quite so easy to chalk up to this. Dark Souls 1 was rushed towards the end thanks to budgetary and time constraints, yet its story remains one of its strongest assets and its dealings with the player remain consistent outside of everyone's favorite boss. Dark Souls 2's story deals with memory and our necessary relationship with our past, and as patchwork as some of the areas are, they still feed into this idea. The game even forces you to enter memories to complete the story. In its themes, Dark Souls 2 asks far more from the player than the first game. It's up to you to remember your history, your experiences from Dark Souls 1, the beginning of Dark Souls 2. Without these, the machinations leading you on are barely intelligible. We seek meaning in this world, yet we're the only ones who can provide it. This is the curse of Dark Souls 2. Part 3. Finding your own purpose. Of particular note is that your character in Dark Souls 3 is unkindled rather than simply being undead. It's both a nod to your role in previous stories as a player and the embodiment of Dark Souls' cyclical nature up to this point. Being unkindled is to have purpose and understand the meaning behind that purpose. This is why your character doesn't hollow upon death in the same way as previous games, and your connection with your character is still tenuous, but if you've made it this far, you're less likely to go completely hollow, hence your character not being as bound to hollowing. Interestingly, you can seek out the old curse in Dark Souls 3, and it's up to you to decide if this is a commentary on people's penchant for self-destruction, the ultimate expression of your freedom, or something else entirely. With Dark Souls coming to its end, Dark Souls 3 adds more machinations for you to lose yourself in with the addition of the Hollows of Londor. They say they've embraced what it means to be cursed and to be hollow, yet they still follow Kath, the serpent pushing the spread of the abyss all the way back in the first game. We know the need for purpose and that it's not enough to live by, and the Hollows embracing the Sabled Church embrace the old purpose perpetuated by a serpent never keen on the whole truth. If you're intent on turning over every stone, as one character in the first DLC puts it, you'll likely wind up falling into the clutches of the Sabled Church as I did on my first playthrough. It's a tradition in storytelling that curiosity without understanding is dangerous, and my falling into the Church's plans illustrates this beautifully. I found a friendly face willing to give me free levels, so far so good. Upon his death, a woman arrives and begins pushing me closer to a well-meaning NPC, and eventually broaches the idea that I should marry them to gain power. Our story ends with a murder and us finally achieving what Kath set out to accomplish 2 games ago. Whether you believe Kath, and by extension the Church, is up to you, but bear in mind that they're still thrusting purpose upon you and are unwilling to tell you more than is absolutely necessary to keep you moving forward. Usurping the power of fire is still an idea given to you by someone else. The same someone else who convinced the people of Ulasil that awakening Manus was a good idea. With Dark Souls 3, the possibilities for purpose grow, yet the lessons learned from Dark Souls 2 remain hugely important. Without understanding any of these purposes, we're doomed to be strung along as I was by the Church that first journey. Without understanding, how much of a core are we for our character? Of the 3 games, Dark Souls 3 is the most clear as to why you're here. No one has yet linked the flame, and you're a contingency plan after the original contingency plan failed. You're basically a murderous janitor forcing those who refuse their duties to perform them. Whether this makes you a hero is once again up to you, but as for why you're doing it, you still need to find it yourself, sometimes very literally. Hidden in the depths of the castle is one such possibility. In a dark and abandoned Firelink shrine, you'll find something that allows you to forge your own path through the half-truths you've been told up to now. You find eyes. There's obvious symbolism in giving the blind sight, but how the Firekeeper describes what she sees is of particular note. We've always seen the darkness as an all-consuming force and little else. The abyss spreads, corrupting those it touches and exposing the darkest parts of human nature, yet this new darkness isn't described as darkness has been in the rest of the series.
The eyes show a world without fire, a vast stretch of darkness. But 'tis different to what is seen when stripped of vision. In the far distance, I sense the presence of tiny flames, like precious embers, left to us by past lords, linkers of the fire. Could this be what draws me to this strangely enticing darkness?
Acknowledging your own smallness in the world is scary. Understanding you are the only one who can give your life meaning is difficult. It's also freeing. If resisting the curse is clinging to purpose, then breaking the curse is defining your own purpose. Dark Souls 3 finally gives you a way to forge your own path explicitly and create an end only you could have found. Interestingly, everything associated with this decision is tied in some way to betrayal. You're betraying the purpose thrust upon you at the start of the game, you're betraying the Firekeeper's intended role of tending to the flame and instead using her to extinguish it. Yet these ideals you betray have caused immeasurable suffering, and if you fulfill your intended purpose, the curse will continue as 2 games have already shown. These ideals were never your own to begin with either, so is it really a betrayal at all? Real existential freedom is scary and full of unknowns. It's also enticing in the same way the Firekeeper describes the darkness she sees. To me, Dark Souls is a series about finding your own meaning and purpose, both in the game and in life. In the beginning, we experience the need for purpose. In the middle, we learn how hollow purpose is with no past or meaning behind it. At the end, we can embrace freedom and the uncertainty that comes with it. Regardless of how your story ends, you and only you are the one that could tell that particular tale and find meaning in that particular journey. If nothing else, Dark Souls is your story. Every single one of your stories. This was as much about helping you understand this as it was for me to point out how Dark Souls is an existential journey. I found my meaning. I found my purpose. I'm not a hollow. This was my journey through Dark Souls. What's yours?